Good evening, everyone. I'm Molly, the Kush RN, and you have reached Conversations with Kush. Tonight, I am joined by an incredible guest, Dr. Uwe Blesching. He is the co-founder of CannaKeys 360 and the chief scientific officer of that website. He has written several books on cannabis, including Cannabis Health Index, which has multiple editions, Breaking the Cycle of Opioid Addiction, and Your Cannabis CBD THC Ratios, which also has several editions. Uwe started as a medic before becoming a doctor and then a writer, and now the co-founder of this incredible research repository, CannaKeys 360. So thank you, sir, for being here. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you on my show.
Thank you, Molly, for your kind words. It's a true pleasure to be here. It's always wonderful to meet kindred spirits in this sphere.
It is indeed. And one of the things that I really like about you is that you support nurses in a variety of ways. In fact, we just talked about how you do a monthly Zoom with the Cannabis Nurse Network. Tell me a little bit more about that and what you're doing with the nurses.
Yeah, we just started that. Heather asked me. Heather is the who started CNN, the Cannabis Nurses Network out of San Diego. And we've been working in the same sphere, and we've been doing cross-platform pollination between CNN and CannaKeys. And so a couple of weeks ago, she invited me to start a new a monthly Zoom meetup where we take a handful of unique studies.
Okay.
And we just sort of spend time with her members and our members to sort of explore, ask questions, comment, and see where the conversation takes us. And so it's always nice to have something that's not so structured, something that leaves the territory open to be explored based on each step that you take. And so I appreciate that approach, and I just finished in fact a meeting with them, and so I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation, if you will, with you as another kindred spirit.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think it is really beneficial to learn from actual case studies when we can have, real-time issues with a patient and then, walk through that modality of treatment and how they were treated and the effects and, the outcomes, right? Because that is at the heart of what we do, the work. That's the real work right there.
Yeah, I think individual case studies or case series are some of my favorite ways to learn about cannabis or cannabinoid-based therapeutics and the effects they're having on the person working with it. And it's the effects, and it's the way the patient describes the details of what it was like for them, for the better or the worse, are some really useful ways for me to translate book learning and research and numbers and quantitative analyses into really where it matters, when it comes to realizing the effects that cannabis ought to have when used properly in the medicinal context. And so it's really nice to look at case studies in that way, or talk to patients and learn from their experiences. And that's why it's really a lot of fun working with nurses, especially because to me, much of the healing that happens in the nurse to patient interaction.
Yeah.
Because there's so much more to healing than the prescription, the intellectual approach, the research that comes into the decision-making process that is often left for the doctors to assume that role. But it really is in the bedside approach, in the holding of hands, in the giving and taking of the moments spent between a patient and a nurse, where I think much of the healing is translated into becoming a reality.
That touches my heart so much. It really does, because
Well, thank you.
I think that, there's so much value in all of the things that you just said, in that first touch, when we're sitting down and we're looking eye to eye with someone, and, we're listening to them cry, or we're listening to their struggles, and, we're really just taking that all in, and then being able to offer up suggestions to them as to, which path they can take, or advocating for the things that they really want, or, just, man, I love what I do, and cannabis has really given me back that passion. Thank goodness, because I lost it during COVID, and I don't know what your experience was like at that time, with direct patient care, but for me, that was a really dark time. And thank goodness for cannabis, because I don't know if I would have been a nurse still today without it. So it's given me back my passion. And as you spoke to before about like doing case studies and stuff, we know that cannabis works so differently amongst different people, and so to learn all those nuances, that again is where that work is done. Like, sometimes we see this type of outcome, sometimes we see that type of outcome. So yeah, it's really important work, and it's a piece that's missing, especially here for us in Minnesota. It's just not talked about. So I understand probably where you are in California, it's a little bit probably a more frequent conversation.
Well, uh, when eye meets eye, soul meets soul. And so I think that while it's not quantifiable, and while it is difficult to measure, the patient contact that nurses have with their patients, the just sometimes just holding the space for somebody to not be alone when they have gotten the worst news of their lives, or when they're going through a really intense um, feeling.
Yeah.
Maybe pain, maybe grief, maybe hopelessness, maybe anxiety, a lot of dysphoric feelings, a lot of challenging emotions come up, and sometimes just being with the patient in that space and holding the space with them is something that is often underrated, as far as giving it the credit that it deserves, as the significant part it really plays, at least in my opinion, in the healing process.
True.
And so that's why I support nurses, and that's why I like working with cannabis, because in so many ways, when we're dealing, or when a patient is dealing with pain, with severe constricting emotions, we completely separated from the capacity to deeply relax
Mm.
and go with the flow, even though it's a painful flow at the moment.
Mhm.
And working with cannabis, utilizing the right type of cannabis, giving it at the right or the appropriate dose, and matching it to each individual's unique needs, will open up that space of deep relaxation, that relaxation response, that going with the flow, even though it may be a painful or constrictive experience in the moment, is a big part of why I believe cannabis works so well for so many different patient populations.
Sure.
And I'm sorry to hear that where you are there, it's more restrictive and
Yeah.
perhaps more difficult, as it should be. Probably it's better in California. Still, there are a great many deals we can do independent of what the laws and policies are. And hopefully we'll get into some of that, throughout this chat of ours today.
I definitely want to hear your thoughts on it, how we initiate those conversations and have those crucial conversations, because we need it. We need it, period. Um, Yeah, I was a labor and delivery nurse, and we talked a lot about like the pain tension cycle. And so, like, when you get all tensed up, and it's just really hard to come back and like come down from that because you've got all this tension going on, and then you're painful. And it's that whole loop, where cannabis can really step in as a tool and interrupt that. So, yeah, it's a
And that's true for, burnout,
sure.
and especially during COVID. I mean, I can't tell you how many of my friends and colleagues, that are still working in the healthcare profession, having patient contacts during COVID. It was just a chaotic, crazy time.
Sure.
Uh, overworking already understaffed nurses on the wards, and then having to deal with an overflowing a number of patients who are not just a little sick, but who are really need intensive attention. Not just to improve their quality of life in the moment, but literally, many of them standing at death's door, aspirating phlegm, needing to be suctioned on a frequent basis, where you can't go as fast from one patient to another because you're only one person. You're
Exactly.
only this many nurses on the floor.
I
As many respiratory therapists that come to your aid, and so the burnout is and was very real, to a point where a lot of nurses are physiologically challenged because they either contracted COVID themselves, or they contracted forms of PTSD,
exactly.
and all of that contributes to burnout, and
Exactly.
so I believe me, I'm no stranger to that feeling. And but compared to what patients go through, you know, imagine the horrors of burnout, and then amplify that by 1,000, when you're at death's doorsteps, and you're confronted with dread, the imminent threat of non-being. And it's not an easy transition, dying with COVID when you're drowning inside your own body. And so it's just it was a horrific time, and for many people suffering from long COVID, it's still an ongoing process. And so it's nice to see people like you who've rediscovered their passion and the pathway forward through that morass of crazy chaos that time was for all of us, really, globally.
Right. From a patient's perspective too. So they do have this incredible illness that they're battling, and they're not armed with the information like we have, or they're not armed with the vision of like, okay, I've seen this before. I kind of know what the outcome is going to be, So there's all this fear and there's all this unknowing. And so that just adds to the problem. And speaking to the PTSD, wow. I mean, for us as nurses, as for providers, for medics, for police officers, for firefighters, like, I think that, we really need to dive into helping professionals to use cannabis in a safe and healthy way that, gives them a good quality of life. And I hope that we can, you and me and the other nurses and the other people that are working in this cannabis science space can help push these policies that allow for that, because it's really needed.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about CannaKeys 360. Give me like a brief overview of what CannaKeys 360 is, and like talk about the mission a little bit.
Sure. It's interesting to note that while the plant has been around forever,
Mhm.
and has been part and parcel of human history in any culture around the planet, with perhaps the exception of Antarctica. But pretty much every medical tradition in the past has realized and utilized the medicinal properties of the plant. And so, but it wasn't really until the late 80s, until a team of researchers at the National Institute of Health discovered the key components that provided the foundation for a better understanding of how cannabis actually works, that changes begun to take hold in academia and in the medical community. And what they discovered is that the body makes its own version of cannabis, and that there are receptor sites that bind with these cannabis-like constituents, and that they induce a number of very potent effects that can be harnessed across a great number of patient populations. In fact, researchers at the same institute I just mentioned, at the NIH, famously said that there isn't a single human disease that couldn't benefit from modulating one or more components of the endocannabinoid system. Now, while that is a pretty powerful statement to come from government researchers, it comes as no surprise now looking back at having done a lot of writing and research in and about the cannabinoid health sciences. But it still takes a long time for the wheels of change to translate into policy changes and into applications in the clinical setting. Right now, I think there are only about 1 in 10 medical schools that are even begin to teach the endocannabinoid system as part of their curriculum. And so there are literally millions of doctors and hundreds of millions of patients demanding from their doctors to know if cannabis or cannabinoid-based therapeutics are a valid potential remedies for what ails them. Especially chronic patient populations who are so fed up by getting a ever-growing list of pharmaceutical drugs that only allows them to manage the signs and symptoms of their conditions, never approaching the possibility of a cure. Right. And so by now, over the last 45 years or so, since the first discovery of these endocannabinoids, of these endocannabinoid receptor sites, that momentum has been growing rapidly. But good information and reliable information and evidence-based information isn't represented the way pharmaceutical information is presented in an organized fashion. And to make up for that lack and to address that needs for cannabis clinicians and patients alike, we decided to create the online platform called CannaKeys. It actually grew out of me writing the first book on the subject called the Cannabis Health Index, right, which basically is an A through Z summary of all the science behind 100 different conditions for which cannabinoid-based therapeutics shows degrees of efficacy. And so it was the first book that I wrote looking at the evidence and what is the evidence and can it work for these 100 specific conditions. And then 5 years later, the second edition came out and it grew to 200 conditions. And the thing with writing a book of that nature is it takes about 2 years to write the new edition. But right, there are about 12 studies that are published on a daily basis, with more of half of them having potential clinical relevance. So the speed with which the science is growing, which is reflective of the excitement the plant has generated in the research community, and so the energy is there, the impetus is there, the need is there, but there really isn't an organization that organizes it in such a way as to make the data that's out there available in such a way so you can quickly integrate it in the clinical setting, so that you know what cannabis constituents to align to meet each of the individual's unique needs of each patient to optimize patient outcomes. And that's what we do. That's what we had set out to do in creating this website, which makes it much faster to translate the speed with which these studies and the content of these studies becomes available, rather than waiting another 3 years to translate the next edition of the Cannabis Health Index. We're doing it now in real time with a team of researchers that input these studies and organize them in such a way similar to the way the book does. And
Sure.
so in that sense, that is why we created the online platform. And what's nice about it is, while I still like learning from a book, there are benefits to utilizing an online platform where you can just at a click go to any way you want to go without having to flip pages, without having to go through reference books, without spending time, reviewing the key findings for all the studies relevant to a particular condition, where it's organized in such a way so as to make the best possible and most discerning decision for a clinician as possible in the easiest and most elegant way, to ideally benefit the patient in the best possible way. So what we want to do is we want to make clinicians, and it doesn't matter if they are a cannabis coach, cannabis nurse, or a cannabis physician, we want to make them the best possible providers to maximize the best possible patient outcomes as possible, and provide with the tools that they need in order to make these decisions fairly quickly, fairly easily, and make the best possible decisions.
That are evidence-based, because we want to be always practicing doing evidence-based care. And also, I mean, this is perfect for the way our healthcare system is now set up, right? Like, how long does a clinician actually get with a patient? It's like 15 minutes, if that, and
if that.
And then there's all this other background noise, that they have if they have a patient that's really sick and they're thinking about that. And, based on whatever knowledge they have about cannabis, it's such a nice, quick reference for people to go to. And you can search by, many different criteria. I think it's best. When I think about CannaKeys, I think it's best utilized by healthcare providers, but this is a great tool for patients and their advocates, and for policymakers to review, to be able to fall back on this and be like, hey, actually, we have this really great data on cannabis. So let's think about changing this law around it. So yeah, it's just a really beautiful tool.
And while we at this point pretty much focused on education and on providers, your point's well taken. In fact, the next iteration of the CannaKeys platform is going to be patient focused and wellness focused, and because there are so many concerns, so many fears about utilizing the plant that make people shy away. Still, the narrative on the war on drugs is in so many ways still socialized into so many people's perspectives and beliefs about the use of the plant, that it's keeping a lot of people that could benefit from modulating the endocannabinoid system in such a way that would benefit them. Now, here is the good thing. This shift I was talking about is based on research that's emerging out of what's been called the endocannabinoid dome. And that's the larger environment that interacts with the classical components of the endocannabinoid system, but is not using any cannabis constituents. So in other words, there's now emerging data that tells us there are a number of nutraceuticals, a number of herbs, a number of dietary things, a number of mind-body approaches that we can utilize to improve endocannabinoid signaling. And to just riff on this a little bit more to provide your listeners with a bit more context, I wanted to use one example, the aging process. There is such a thing as optimal aging, and then there is what's called suboptimal aging. And so in suboptimal aging, think of it as aging faster than you need to.
Right.
having signs and symptoms of aging appear faster than you need to, really losing your resilience to stressors like a flu virus or a cold, getting them more often, or having a cold last a lot longer than it used to be. The signs in, when you were 20, when you were a
Right.
teenager, when you bounced back from a viral disease fairly quickly, or, when you could pull an all-nighter and then have pizza for breakfast and go to school, no problem.
Right.
When you're 40, 50, 60, 70, those things don't quite work anymore. It takes longer to recover. And one of the reasons we now know is because as we grow older, our older selves contain a great number of fewer endocannabinoid receptor sites,
Mm.
and which translates into suboptimal endocannabinoid signaling,
Sure.
which translates into loss of resilience, which translates into longer recovery time, and all of those things that are part and parcel of suboptimal aging, for example.
Hmm.
Now, there are ways to compensate for the loss of endocannabinoid receptor sites.
Yep.
We can use cannabinoid-based therapeutics, but in those states where it's difficult, or for those people who don't want to use cannabis for whatever their reasons are, there are a number of things we can do to actually improve endocannabinoid signaling. And that needs to be part and parcel of the discussion, because too many times we just talk about cannabis and it's about endocannabinoid medicine, a new field, a new emerging field in medicine, a new specialty, and or the cannabinoid health sciences, or however you want to call it.
Yeah.
We have now literally tens of thousands of studies that look at what can be done. How can we hack the endocannabinoid system to improve our health and well-being, which can benefit all chronic patient populations across the board, but it can also help with wellness. It can help with shifting suboptimal aging to an optimal aging range. And there are things we can utilize that improve endocannabinoid signaling that have nothing to do with cannabis.
Right. Like
Example,
diet,
taking turmeric, for example,
Right.
improves endocannabinoid receptor site expression. Exercise, age-appropriate cardio exercise improves endocannabinoid signaling. Tai Chi and yoga, for example, or engaging in cognitive behavioral therapies, for example, learning to become emotionally intelligent, learning to relax when many of us have forgotten how to deeply relax. Things that the plant teaches us, helps us to remember. We can also use Tai Chi if you absolutely believe that cannabis is something you don't want to deal with. Take up Tai Chi. It will improve your endocannabinoid signaling and help mitigate a number of the chronic underlying pathologies that most chronic diseases share. When you engage in improving endocannabinoid signaling, you reduce chronic inflammation, which is part and parcel of most chronic diseases. You improve oxidative stress. You mitigate chronic pain. You reduce the dysphoria associated with the latter, and you improve quality of life. All of those things are part and parcel of all chronic diseases, and improving endocannabinoid signaling will help mitigate all of these things that feed a chronic illness and the aging process.
Even having better relationships with our family or our friends, or being in community or spiritual practices, or a healthy sex life. Those are all things that can support our endocannabinoid system. And
Very well put. Love it.
Yeah. And I think, again, speaking to, how nurses are kind of like the natural coaches to help people, be guided along in this journey. And I think a lot of times, to what you said earlier, is, people they have this idea about cannabis. They don't want to use an illicit drug, but like there's so many options for cannabis that don't make you high. And I think that, just opening up that scope for people and allowing them to realize like, hey, this is really beneficial. And I don't even have to feel funny, or, I don't have that euphoria feeling, even though I think that's one of the best benefits of cannabis myself. But yeah, I agree. And do you feel like most of the things, like a lot of disease processes then are like an endocannabinoid deficiency? Because I've heard that about like migraines or I don't know, other things.
Yes, in a word, but just to repeat that a notion that was put forth by the team of researchers that was involved in discovering the components of the endocannabinoid system. According to them, and
Right.
I'm preaching to the choir, and I'm clearly biased, but according to this is government researchers saying there is not a single disease that wouldn't benefit from modulating components of the endocannabinoid system. Now, what they didn't say is use cannabis. They said improving endocannabinoid signaling, improving endocannabinoid function. And there are many ways of doing it, including there are many cannabis constituents that absolutely do not produce changes in cognition, but can be harnessed along with the other modulators of the larger environment that interacts with the endocannabinoid system called the EC-BOM, like I just talked about. You can bring in echinacea. It binds with CB2 receptor sites, reducing inflammation at 1/5 the strength of THC. You have no cognitive changes from echinacea, but one of the reasons it works so well is because the endocannabinoid system. And so to ground this in one clinical trial that just came out of Florida, they gave patients suffering from metabolic syndrome, which is implicated in pre-diabetes, in diabetes, and of course in obesity. So these patients were obese and they suffered from metabolic syndrome. And what they did for 90 days, they gave them 16 milligrams of THCV and 20 milligrams of CBD on a daily basis, once a day. They would get this remedy. And after 90 days, they recorded a significant weight loss. It caused a significant reduction in bad cholesterol and a number of other metabolic healthcare markers. And so these are clinical studies that are emerging now, right and left, and have been emerging for the past 45 years that we can now harness into in the clinical setting, where we can literally take that study and reapply it to any patient that suffers from the same chronic conditions for which there's very little things that one can do beyond managing with pharmaceuticals, but actually approximating the potential of a cure or a complete prevention of the deterioration of metabolic syndrome into prediabetes and diabetes, simply done by utilizing two components of cannabis. Neither of them will induce cognitive changes. Now, CBD will improve your mood, but a mood change is not a cognitive change. And so at least that's how I describe one of the key differences in terms of how one feels about utilizing THC, which is the primary psychoactive component of cannabis, and CBD, which improves your mood but does not change your cognition. That's my key definition when it comes to affecting the mind between those two cannabinoids. And THCV is another a gift that the plant offers to us, and so it's nice to see the science providing details we can use in the clinical setting, and we can use as cannabis coaches, as cannabis nurses, to advise our patients to consider as part of their healthcare regimen.
100%. Help me understand research a little bit, and my audience understand research.
If I can.
So CannaKeys has about over 4,000 studies to draw upon at this time. And
10, actually. We're approaching 10,000.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's incredible. And as you said, it's growing exponentially as people are glomming on to the medical benefits of cannabis. when a person is looking at research, so there's a difference between like doing research on a specific drug where you're trying to treat, like, let's say you're trying to treat IBS versus, I want to see how cannabis can affect IBS. So like you talk about a little bit about primary studies and related studies. How does that work within CannaKeys?
Okay, let me try to not make this too long an answer.
Okay.
There are, you mentioned primary and related studies, and
Yeah.
that's an important distinction because right now there are tens of thousands of studies are out there. And when you go to PubMed and you feed in a keyword, let's say cannabis, you get tens of thousands of entries. You
Yes.
add and enter cannabis and a particular condition, you may still get, hundreds and hundreds of specific studies. So first of all, you want to go through this process and find out which studies specifically looked at cannabis, the endocannabinoid system, and that particular condition, rather than just a peripheral mention, in the study about, we looked at, CB2 receptor sites, and they may be involved with IBS. They may not be, but there is potential and more research is needed. That's a related study. So
Okay.
that study doesn't have as much value as a study that looked at IBS and specific components of the endocannabinoid system or specific cannabinoid constituents in the treatment context of IBS.
Mhm.
So those would be a primary study. So we filter those out separately.
Okay.
And so then we don't dismiss the related ones, but we give them a different weight. And so you find them in the lower portion of how we present the research. The more prominent portion is reserved for primary studies, and they are organized in order of importance.
Okay.
So the study that has the lowest importance, the lowest weight, are studies that are done in the Petri dish. They are laboratory studies. So they get the lowest weight. They're important. They give us insights, potential treatment trends, but they're not as heavily important when it comes to where the rubber meets the road, where a patient really needs to, have a sign or symptom of what ails them be dealt with in an appropriate and effective fashion. Next level up would be animal studies.
Right.
The next one up from there would be, let's say, case studies, case series, expert opinions. Then we switch over to clinical trials, which are clinical trials, but not double blind, just regular clinical trials. Then there are double blind clinical trials. And then there are meta-analyses and systematic reviews of only clinical trials. And that is the gold standard. That is the highest weight of study that we give. And so we organize the studies in that way so that when you look at a dashboard for a particular condition, you instantly see with the state of the science. Is it all preclinical, or has the impetus of the state of the science shifted to clinical trials? And if so, how advanced are clinical trials? Is there
Okay.
just one clinical trial that is maybe useful, maybe helpful, or is there now an abundance of trials that can be summarized and translated into supporting the best discerning decisions in the clinical setting that clearly say, this is what you should be doing if the patient presents in this particular fashion?
Okay. One of the other things, and then I'll move on from this topic, but I think it's important for people to understand how research is done and what is good research and what isn't.
Mhm.
One of the things that I've heard about cannabis is that there are thousands of research projects done on cannabis, but we have the added element of, a lot of them being done on animals. And also the caveat of the way the study is designed, looking at cannabis as something that's harmful versus something that's beneficial. And a lot of the research, at least, prior to the last maybe 10 years, had been done where it was viewing cannabis as like a harmful subject. Would you agree with that necessarily? And do you see that really shifting now?
Well, it's funny because we're literally spending a great deal of time of inputting studies and looking at studies. And those research teams that are clearly motivated by the narrative on the war on drugs, they tend to produce studies. They tend to ask questions that are informed by that narrative.
Right.
And so the results, the outcomes is also informed by that narrative. However, we don't dismiss them. We, in fact, include all studies because we believe all studies can be learned from, including learning that some research are biased. And that is an important, criteria to bring to bear when you look at the data that they produced.
100%.
And so the other thing that we found out is that over time, the bias shows up and the truth emerges out of the consensus of all the studies that have been conducted, including by people that are more neutral or that are more in favor of, have a more open-minded perspective in terms of how they look at the research that they're conducting. And so out of that, over time, our experience has been that the truth will clearly emerge and the bias will also clearly emerge. And so we're trying to pay attention to that, and we try to present the entire mix of what's out there in such a way that that bias shows and that bias can teach us something.
Yeah. Great point. I mean, I guess I'd never really thought about it like that, but yeah, that is a really great point. And so we don't just throw that out, right? And I always, talk when I have, debates with people, they're like, well, statistics show. And I was like, really, you can use statistics and skew them to fit any narrative you want. So I think sometimes research can be dealt with in a similar way, unless it's, using that gold standard as you spoke to earlier. If a clinician is going to utilize CannaKeys, kind of walk me through the process. So within CannaKeys, so it's a subscription service. You can try it for a week, which is really awesome. I found a beautiful demonstration of it actually in real time on YouTube. And that took me through, and I understood very quickly as to what CannaKeys is and how it can be utilized. But you can search by medical condition, you can search by specific cannabinoid, you can search by terpenes, you can search by organ system. So talk a little bit about how a provider can use these tools and kind of give a little breakdown of how that happens.
Sure. One of the things we want to do is we want to enable clinicians to make the most informed and most discerning decision on an evidence-based basis. And so we organized the entire platform to produce those results. So if you're a cannabis nurse and you're consulting with somebody that is about to call you on your Zoom, and their history, they have hypertension, whatever it is, right? So you go to the CannaKeys platform, perhaps even while you're talking to them. You go to the conditions page, which are organized A through Z. You pick hypertension, you click on hypertension, and you instantly see the dashboard. And so you instantly have a grasp of the state of the science. Where is the state of the science? Is it all preclinical? Is there clinical data? If there is clinical data, is there dosing information? What's the FDA's position on it? What's the EU's legislation say about it? So sometimes instantly you say, oh, the EU approved dronabinol, which is a synthetic pharmaceutical version of THC, in the treatment of as an off-label for hypertension. So there's a significant weight of a governmental institution that supports the use. Sometimes the FDA has given approval to a cannabinoid-based therapeutic, and you'll see that at a glance, right?
Right.
If you want to dig deeper and look at what are the trials that offer dosing information, we make that search very easy rather than having to weave through the hundreds of trials on PubMed. You can instantly filter for only those studies that provide dosing information. You can provide, you can filter for example, show me all trials that showed a positive effect for CBD in the treatment context of whatever condition, and it will show you that. Now, the other thing that we are trying to do is to save the clinician as much time as possible, because it takes a lot of time to keep up. And if you're not a specialty where you see the same type of patient over and over again, where you see a greater abundance and diversity of patients,
Like a family
it's
practice
especially useful
doctor.
to do that, right? So, and what we're doing now also is, whenever possible, whenever the science is there, whenever there is a study that is so superb and so elegant and so safe, we begin to translate them now into treatment algorithms, which are treatment guidelines or treatment maps that take you through the screening process, so that you instantly find out, are there contraindications? What are patient preferences about what kind of cannabis experience they wish to have? What are other concerns I need to take into account? And then it'll take you pretty much like an ACL's algorithm for VFib or for asystole or for bradycardia. It takes you through a process that spits out at the end a specific treatment regimen that's evidence-based and that's as safe as possible. Now, the treatment algorithms we are putting forth, they are more flexible than the ACLS, which tend to be more rigid, because you still need to bring to bear many of the moving parts that are absent when you're dealing with pharmaceuticals, because you're now dealing with emerging evidence. You're dealing with a great number of different cannabis constituents that have different pharmacodynamics. In other words, they produce different effects in the patient, and they're metabolized in different ways. And so the more you learn about how each cannabis constituent works in the human body or in each individual patient, the more you are able to optimize the patient effects. And you also want to have them be flexible enough to bring in your expertise and your own experience.
Right.
And so they're a bit more flexible, but there's still guidelines that provide you with specific dosing information that's based on the latest clinical trials. And so that is something our members really have taken to, because it allows for a consistent approach within the patient population, but still allows for enough flexibility to adjust to each individual patient's unique needs, and to still bring to bear your unique experience and your own expertise into the picture in a way that makes sense.
Right.
And so we start with the three big ones, chronic pain, insomnia, and anxiety. But now I think we have a total of 9 or 10 algorithms. And the next one is the one the study I mentioned earlier about the metabolic syndrome. We're going to convert that into a treatment algorithm, because it's just such a great study, and the cannabinoids involved have such a good safety record, over decades, that we feel confident, even though there aren't too many clinical studies that are out there. But we're going to convert that study into a treatment algorithms that clinicians can use for their metabolically challenged patients.
This is incredible, because this is exactly what we need. We need these tools at the bedside to make the clinical applications for people, and I think this is where providers often get skittish about recommending cannabis, or when their patients bring it up, they're like, oh, I don't know about that. Like, I just think you should avoid it. I think this is such an empowering tool that we can use, and we need more of them. We need more screening tools, like when people are getting ready to go to surgery. Have you used cannabis in the last 72 hours? Did you smoke it? Did you use an edible? Like, these are things that we just need to get integrated into the bedside so that we can open up these conversations. And so this is really incredible work. When I saw that you were doing the algorithms, I thought, oh, great, because it gives a guide, and the dosing too. I think people are like, well, yeah, cannabis, it's going to work for me probably, but like, where do I start? And where are they seeing the effects be really, where are they seeing how much CBD a person needs on a daily basis so that their anxiety can be managed, every day, and they don't wake up anxious or whatever it is. So yes, please continue to do this incredible work of making algorithms. I think nurses always really appreciate that. And of course, again, it's evidence-based practice, so which we're always getting back to. Tell me,
Here.
what's that? Here.
Here.
So one of the things too that I really like about the website is that you talk about different chemovars or chemotypes. I always say chemovars, but chemotypes. So I think that is a really useful tool that maybe it mentions it on the website, but maybe that people don't think that they necessarily could use CannaKeys for, but I think it's good for formulators. I think it's good for growers to understand that people need these different types of medicine. They're not always going to need a super high percentage THC, or they're going to need something that kind of balances it out, or they need a more CBD dominant strain. So talk a little bit more about why that's important and why you chose to include it in there.
Sure. When you go to a pharmacy and you look at the shelves, you see thousands of different pill bottles, but you never make the assumption that just because they're all pills, they're all the same. They're all for the same thing. Right. And that's the mistake people make with cannabis. There are literally tens of thousands of strains that are out there, and they all have their own unique chemical formulation, chemical constituents. Now, some differences are very subtle and some differences are significant. And the biggest importance of differences of discernments between the chemical constituents that are in there and the effects that they induce have to do with the ratio between THC and CBD. So when we first started CannaKeys, the whole notion of chemotypes, which was really defined in the early 70s by a number of chemists who worked on the nomenclature of the distinctions of naming different types of cannabis. And they came up with 5 different types, but in the clinical setting, only 3 are relevant. And so the first type 1, if you will, the chemotype 1 is predominantly THC with little or no CBD. Mm-hmm. A chemotype 2 is defined as containing relative equal amounts, roughly between about 1 to 4 to 4 to 1 between THC to CBD. And then a chemotype 3 contains mostly CBD and only tiny amounts of THC. Now, it turns out there are a great number of research that clearly indicates that certain patient populations clearly benefit from one or another of the chemotypes. That is the ratio between THC and CBD. For instance, patients with strokes, patients with spinal cord injuries, patients recovering from opioid addiction clearly and have withdrawal clearly benefit from a chemotype 1, a high abundant amount of THC. When it comes to a 1-to-1, patients with multiple sclerosis, for example, primary and secondary symptoms of MS clearly benefit from a balanced ratio. The same is true for patients suffering from fibromyalgia, for example. Patients suffering from pediatric seizure disorders, for example, clearly benefit from a cannabis chemotype 3, which contains mostly CBD. So all of the pediatric seizure disorders that you see so much in the research, they correspond to benefiting from CBD abundant strains. And so right now, these chemotypes are reflected in the FDA approved pharmaceutical analogs of them. Dronabinol or Marinol is an analog of chemotype 1. Sativex is an analog of chemotype 2, and Epidiolex is an analog of a chemotype 3. So the pharmaceutical industry clearly understands the science and has begun to produce and market individual chemotype to the different populations that benefit from them. And you can go online and search for those pharmaceuticals and look at their descriptions that come with the remedy, and it's clearly indicated and FDA approved what these unique pharmaceuticals that are basically cannabinoids, basically, synthetic versions or extraction of the plant cannabis itself at those ratios, and see for yourself, how it's applied and what the FDA thinks is okay to do.
Yeah, I like it because I think developing that lexicon or that nomenclature is really important. I kind of cringe a little bit when I hear people say like sativa and indica, but I understand that people need a simple breakdown of like the basic principles of like what a certain strain would do for me, but I think developing that lexicon is important and really empowering again to patients like, hey, maybe I do need a chemovar type 2 versus, I need the best hybrid sativa dominant, so I just always think, kind of bringing it back around and using the proper nomenclature is really important. So go ahead.
In the medical setting, it's also important to realize that the indica and sativa distinction, while holding importance for growers, there are a number of differences that are relevant to growers. In the medical setting, they have lost their meaning because they're imprecise at best, and
right.
The effects and the cannabis constituents can vary even within the same strain from one growth cycle to the next. And so you can't rely on the presumed qualities of an indica or of a sativa in order to claim and reproduce a very specific effect that's associated with the specific numbers and specific ratios of how many milligrams of THC and CBD is in the product that's going to serve me best.
Right. Or even a strain name, right?
Oh, even, yeah. I mean, it's an orange Kush is a name for a specific a strain of cannabis, but it's the numbers, the amount of THC and the amount of CBD in that particular strain of an OG that matters. And so if you're going to a dispensary and you happen to know the ratio of the OG Kush that you used last time that really worked for you, the OJ Kush that you're getting at the dispensary now may not be producing the same results. Right. It's better if we want a precision, if you want to realize a precision effect, to go to the dispensary and tell them the numbers. Last time I got a 22% THC and 7% CBD. I want something that matches those percentages. Right. That is a more accurate indicator than to go by the strain name.
Or even taking it a step further and teaching them how to read a COA.
Of course.
Right?
Absolutely. Preaching to the choir.
And teaching them about terpenes, because that is really where we dial into those feelings that we get from cannabis, right? Talk a little bit about the research behind terpenes. Is there really exciting research that's coming out that's related to terpenes, and what kinds of effects are we seeing, and how are those applied to people?
Well, it's interesting. Terpene research is itself a branch of research that academia has spent a significant amount of time and energy and resources on exploring. That's why we included not just conditions in the CannaKeys platform, but we also included a section where you can search for cannabinoids and where you can search for terpenes just by themselves. And so we're tracking the major terpenes and the research behind them, and they are formulated and organized in the same way I described earlier, the dashboard. And so there's a huge amount of interest in terpenes and the physiological effects and the effects on mind and body and mood that becomes part and parcel of finding the ideal cannabis constituents and fine-tuning the effects that you want to realize. And so terpenes have a lot to do with creating what's been termed the synergistic effect or the entourage effect,
Right.
or what is the other term they use?
The flow state, right? I've
Well,
heard you talk a lot about like the mind, body, spirit connection and kind of getting into that flow state and how terpenes can really be beneficial towards that specific experience.
yes. I'm still hung up on the symphony. What's the anyway? The term that I'm looking for escapes me right now. But let's talk about flow state.
Yeah.
There's a lot of research that's come out looking at flow state and how it can be utilized to increase productivity. It's a term frequently utilized to describe a number of things one can do and use in the wellness market. And so a flow state is a state where you operate on the idea that everything happens in the best possible and the most elegant way. It's like sometimes people use the surf analogy. Sometimes when you're a surfer, there are 50 waves. They were so, but then there's that one wave where everything hits the right everything, and you're literally transcended into a higher state of being where you feel at one in the present moment with everything on the inside and everything on the outside lined up in such a way that brings bliss to the present moment of whatever it is that you're going through. And you don't have to be a surfer. You can be a painter, a writer, a presenter, a cook. You get into that state of flow. And there is a Czech researcher, a psychiatrist, who termed the notion of flow state. And ever since he wrote the book on flow state, a lot of research has flown into that. And now we're beginning to understand that the endocannabinoid system and endocannabinoid signaling may be part and parcel of what is inducing flow states. And which brings us in a way back full circle to when we started this conversation, talking about when eye meets eye, soul meets soul, when you are the nurse at the bedside, being present with whatever the patient is going through in the moment. And you can experience flow states in that place. Patients can experience it in that place, and the nurse can experience it in that place, and sometimes together. And so perhaps you know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely do, sir.
And many times, especially when we are dealing with trauma, we tend to forget what it feels like to deeply relax and to be in the present moment, even when it's difficult. And cannabis, using the right type of cannabis, given at the appropriate dose, matched to each individual's unique needs, can induce that relaxation response that is synonymous with flow.
Yes.
And so it becomes meditative at that point. It becomes a spiritual thing at that point. And maybe you and maybe the listener can relate to it in their own way in terms of what that might mean. And I'm excited to see that there's more and more studies looking at the science of flow state and bringing in the spiritual component, especially when you're looking at research that's emerging out of looking at other teacher plants, like psilocybin, looking at ayahuasca, looking at research around ketamine, looking at research around MDMA, other psychotropic in the therapeutic setting, especially in dealing with chronic diseases, in terms of how a spiritual insight, in terms of how a deep and profound release, emotional release, can facilitate a healing experience that can be described as a flow state, as a aha moment, as a lasting insight. And so working with cannabis is one of those teacher plans, especially if you use it with that intention in mind, that can put the clutch on your daily perceptive devices and suspend the things that normally run your moment-to-moment awareness to where you can look at what needs looking at, and where you can release what needs releasing, and where you can make a shift at a very deep level that can produce a lasting shift in terms of perhaps even creating a divorce between the word chronic and whatever ails you. And so I welcome these types of research, and we bring in these modulators of the endocannabinoid dome, which many of them are, because now we're realizing that psilocybin, ketamine, ayahuasca are actually modulating components of the endocannabinoid system in a therapeutic fashion. And so these plants, these experiences can work hand in hand to mitigate so much of what has become chronic in terms of mental diseases, or in terms of what ails us physically.
Part of this platform, this podcast platform, is, always asking people about their personal relationship with cannabis. And I love sitting down across from someone. And I actually really look forward to this in patients. Sitting down across from someone and be like, how has cannabis helped you? How has it changed your life? How has it made you a better person, a better partner, a better husband, a better parent, a better mom? So I think that it is really important. It can bring that veil down so that we can have what you alluded to earlier, what you spoke to about having like a really genuine and authentic interaction with someone. That's what it has allowed for me, especially as I spoke to earlier about having so much PTSD. I got to a point, sir, where I couldn't even like look people in the eye anymore. I was so guarded and so inundated and fearful about going to work. It was hard for me to even have like an interaction with another person. So yeah, that's what cannabis can do for us. Definitely.
And here's the other thing that's really interesting. Many times when you get an aha moment, when you get an insight from a wonderful cannabis experience that sort of transcends some aspect of whatever it is that you challenged with, you can actually work on repeating that and reapply it over and over again, even without having to rely on cannabis. Mm-hmm. And that is when it becomes really empowering and impactful, where you can literally, live a life informed by a deep transcending aha moment that you had during the experience with the teacher plant, but then apply it and remember it and try to recreate it, make the choices, and make the shift in your belief system that allow you to take a new perspective over and over and over and over again without even having to rely on it. And then once it becomes part of your life, then lean on the teacher plan and let's see what else is out there.
Right.
What else can I learn? What else do I need to look at? Is there another layer of this that I need to,
dig into?
It's called shadow work. I mean, this is what Jung called shadow work. I mean, we all have these things that we hide in the recesses of our minds, because at the time when the trauma happened, we weren't equipped to deal with it. So it gets tucked away. Part of us tucks it away until we're ready to deal with it. And that's what happens sometimes in these experiences. It's brought back into the present moment of our awareness, because now we're ready to deal with it.
Right. It's too painful sometimes to deal with in the moment.
Right.
I had that experience actually from microdosing psilocybins. I worked with Megan Bang, the trusted Canna nurse, and Ariane Williams, and did a cohort of all nurses where we did psilocybin microdosing and did really intentional work around journaling and education and being in community with each other. And I want to just say that that was one of the most life-changing things I've ever done in my 50 years on this earth. So thank goodness for plant medicine.
You're here.
Yeah. Tell me, if you don't mind, about your own personal relationship with cannabis. How did you come to cannabis, and how does it help you?
Very interesting. When I came to America, in my early 20s, I went to paramedic school at Stanford, and I got hired by the San Francisco Department of Public Health straight away, and I worked as a medic there for a couple decades. And when you work on the streets, you come across all types of drugs, pharmaceutical and recreational, and you see what effects these substances induce in each individual, and you clearly become curious about, wow, that is something I would never do, because I never want to look like that or feel like that.
Right.
And that is something that looks really interesting. And so I started looking at drugs with the notion in mind in terms of what kind of 911 calls they generated.
Mm.
And it was at that time in the late 80s when the AIDS epidemic hit San Francisco and many of the metropolitans around the world. And it was the AIDS patients, many of the AIDS patients who were giving nothing from Western medicine, Orthodox medicine that worked at the time, who were the first to explore alternative approaches. And it was their advocates and AIDS patients who started utilizing cannabis. And they found out very quickly that it addressed a number of AIDS-related symptoms in a very quick and beneficial way. Wasting's disease, anorexia, lack of appetite, and a great number of other symptoms a cluster of symptoms associated with it. And so it was amazing to see the difference between one AIDS patient who utilized cannabis and another AIDS patient who didn't. Mm. And that was my first clue, just seeing it in real life play out. The next thing was cancer patients. Cancer patients quickly realized that chemotherapy in those days was horrific. Always hair loss, always horrific nausea and cyclical vomiting, horrible quality of life. Those that use cannabis, completely different picture. So I started to look at it, and I started to look at the science at the time, which was very sparse. But the other thing is, people, when you're in the medical field, all your friends and all your associates, sooner or later, they come and ask you for something. Do you think this could work? What do you think about this? Yeah. And so people would ask about, do you think cannabis would work for this, or cannabis would work for that? And I said, look, I've seen it work on AIDS patients. I've seen it work on cancer patients. So, but let me look it up for you. And so I started looking it up for that specific question of that particular friend or whatever. And that process, I started writing, taking notes, and then I would report back to them. Okay. And that process over time led to the writing of the first book, the Cannabis Health Index, covering the evidence behind 100 different conditions. I mean, literally, that was the start. And, awesome. And that's how it sort of like started. And I'm very sensitive to THC, so it's little bit goes a long way. And
Yeah.
I've made the mistakes often and early on when I would take an edible and I was really hungry and oh, I don't feel anything. Let me take some more. And all of a sudden I'm so blasted. I'm literally having a panic attack. I'm convinced I'm dying. Had
Yeah.
I not been a paramedic and know exactly what I'm going through intellectually, where I could talk myself down, put myself in a room with dimmed light and play some calming music and have, a friend hold my hand,
Yeah. Right. Right.
I would have called 911 because I was convinced, that's how horrific it was when you cross that fine line between a therapeutic effect and an adverse effect. And so, however, utilizing it personally, mostly only when I need it for something very specific. Like I have a sprained shoulder, I need an anti-inflammatory. I have a sore gum. I apply some beta caryophyllene with some full spectrum I make myself, and next day it's gone. So those are like the little things I do, sometimes a really bad headache that comes from a tension in the neck,
Mhm.
that the massage doesn't really help, but, taking a couple puffs of some, to the point where I feel it, but I'm not, where I'm feeling relaxed enough where I can just go with the pain and just be with it, create a
Right.
space where I'm sort of okay with it. That's often enough to help me pass through it and come out on the other side. Next day I'm fine. So those are the little subtle approaches of self-care where I utilize various cannabis products and mostly make for myself.
That's awesome. I always say that, I don't really make a ton of differentiation between medical cannabis and the adult rec consumer. We're all treating our own set of symptoms, right? Even if it's to feel joy and euphoria.
It's an easy argument to make. And you mentioned euphoria. I totally do not understand why orthodox medicine thinks of it as an adverse effect.
Right.
I mean, right there, that is poets from all over the world, from times, immemorial, have looked for the state of euphoria as an inspiration. Why would it be considered an adverse effect? It could be part and parcel of extraordinary state of consciousness that propels you into a new state of being.
Right.
That can have profound changes that can last a lifetime. Why is that an adverse effect?
And isn't the point of life to be happy, to to move your way through your life in this one meat puppet that we have, and to make it the most of what you can and be happy? I don't know.
Absolutely.
Is there a DNA component to what CannaKeys is doing? Are you looking at like DNA markers and trying to identify, what chemotypes can work for specific things? Are you getting that deep?
Yeah, we are looking at research that is attempting to explain the changes that happen when there are in different people that have a different endocannabinoid expression,
Mm,
a different endocannabinoid tone.
yeah.
They're looking at specific genetic markers or different genotype or different phenotypes, and they're trying to correlate, that in a meaningful way, so that like for example, you probably heard about cannabis hyperemesis syndrome.
I certainly
And
have.
so interestingly enough, when you look at the medical history, it's never been part and never been reported in history books as far as medical history books is concerned.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that it's associated with a high percentage of THC, because now we're approaching over 30% in some strains.
Yeah.
And so is it connected to that? More specifically, are there specific genotypes, specific types of people that have certain genetic expressions on a cellular basis in certain tissue-specific aspects of their physiology that develop cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, while other people who use the same type of cannabis have a perfectly fine experience.
Yeah.
And so there is research out there that's beginning to look at that, and that's one example. Another interesting element is there are now some companies that are looking to test your genetic genotypes or phenotypes and try to match it with the ideal strain of cannabis. And while that can work, or while that's interesting to a point, there are so many things that cannot be measured genetically that come to bear that are significant. And I'm especially talking about mind-body components that can never be measured or controlled, that play a significant part in how someone's experience, how somebody unfolds under a specific cannabis experience. And so yeah, there may be some interesting insights to be had along those lines, but I don't think there's going to be a very precise way. And maybe in some very specific cases, maybe that's the case, but I don't think there'll ever be let me test your genetic markers and find you the ideal cannabis type, and that it works across a broad patient population. So I think while while it's interesting and while there is a place for that, I don't think there's going to be a prescription based on genetic testing.
I do like the DNA testing though, because I think it just further legitimizes, like how well cannabis can really work with your body and interact with your body. So, and in speaking, to those like deficiencies that we have and how we can bolster our own endocannabinoid, our intrinsic endocannabinoids, so that we don't have to use so many from the plant.
There's interesting testing research being done where they look for by the presence of anandamide or 2-AG, two of the natural occurring cannabinoids that the body makes itself.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they discovered that there is a near 100% predictive element checking for anandamide levels to predict miscarriages.
Oh, wow.
So they discovered that when your anandamide levels drop beyond a certain point, the fertilized egg will not implant in the uterine wall or will not stabilize in the uterine wall. And so they're beginning to develop tests based on endocannabinoid markers that are predictive. And so that is from a practical point of view, speaks to what you just said you like about genetic markers or genetic testing. And so interesting things are going to emerge as far as let's test for anandamide levels, and then we know.
Yes, that is awesome. And, I work in emergency care now. I'm an ER nurse, but labor and delivery has always been near and dear to my heart. And I just am so disheartened by the attitudes around cannabis use in peri-pregnancy. So before, during, and after, and even during the labor process, I think cannabis could be so helpful to women going through the labor process, as we've already spoken to several times about that pain tension cycle, and just like breaking that up and knowing that there are these other cannabinoids out there that will not cause that euphoria feeling that people are so concerned about, or like they don't have to be smoking cannabis in order to get relief. They can use a dermal patch or a bath bomb or a topical, or, so many options. And I just really want to see that area of research open up and formulations coming out of it too.
I mean, it's interesting. I've been interested in this myself, anything around the perinatal and substances, and including cannabis. And when we look at the evidence, for literally thousands of studies that have been done on the perinatal and the endocannabinoid system and the impact of cannabis, the absolute vast majority is very clear that, the research makes it very clear to be, as much as I don't like it to be the case, when we look at the data, and it's all correlation data, there isn't, we can't do a trial, comparing pregnant women who take cannabis and who do not take cannabis, and it just wouldn't be moral. You wouldn't get approval for a trial like that. So all the data is correlation data, but it's clear that 99% of the studies sadly say that the use of cannabis during pregnancy and during lactation produces shifts in the endocannabinoid system. We know the endocannabinoid system is involved from spermatogenesis, from the production of an egg, to the process of sex itself, to the implantation of a fertilized egg. We know the endocannabinoid system is deeply involved in all of these processes. We also know that utilizing various forms of cannabis can alter that natural process, and we are only beginning to understand the implications of it. And so there are a number of conditions we track on CannaKeys, like postpartum depression, for which women take cannabis, for dysmenorrhea, for menstrual difficulties, for endometriosis, for a number of OBGYN related conditions, many of which, the use of cannabis shows degrees of efficacy. When it comes to its impact on the offspring, the signs and the trends are sadly very, very clear. And so as much as I love the fact that cannabis helps with postpartum depression and dysmenorrhea and with menstrual pain, it's just, the impact on the fetus has to be considered. And so reporting on the evidence isn't always what I'd like it to be, but so far the evidence is pretty clear that its impact on the offspring is consistently reported as negative.
Well, I'm gonna definitely stay abreast of that because, it's just
that makes the two of us.
Awesome. You have written an entire book on opioid addiction and using cannabis to overcome that. So talk a little bit about that work, please, sir.
Sure. The opioid epidemic was just horrific to behold, but it wasn't new to me because many of our daily calls in San Francisco had to do with patients being apneic and having pinpoint pupils, which are, as an ER nurse, what that means. Soon as you see somebody completely lethargic, completely flaccid, with being apneic or a depressed respiratory rate and pinpoint pupils, they overdosed on heroin or opioids or from various pharmaceutical versions of it, And so in the emergency room setting, of course, Narcan, you give Narcan and within 30 seconds to a minute, depending on how much Narcan you give them, you instantly wake them up and they're happy, or they go instantly into withdrawal and they want to hit you over the head because how dare you, kill their high, and now they're in a horribly dysphoric state. They're going into withdrawals, and you created withdrawal symptoms because you gave them too much Narcan. And that's why I always try to do just as much to stop their respiratory depression, but not to push them into withdrawal. And however, it's very difficult to titrate, as you
it is.
probably well know. So I'm very familiar with the aspects of an acute overdose, and I had family members who were addicted to lifelong addictions to heroin, and so I'm familiar how much it destroys their lives, their family lives, and the quality of lives. And so I was motivated to look into this and to provide alternatives. And so I did a deep dive into looking at using cannabis from a harm reduction perspective and from a perspective of addressing the underlying pathology, especially the mind-body pathology of why people turn to heroin or opioids in the first place. And it's consistent a significant amount of hurt and pain. And I'm not just talking physical hurt or pain. I'm literally talking pain at a spiritual level,
Right.
a pain that is so deep, that cuts so deep. You may not see the scars on their body, but you do see the scars on their soul. And many times it takes an opioid to just be able to function, in spite of this pain. And so I certainly understand the need to self-medicate to deal with that pain, because there's so little other constructive things that are out there to
Right.
help deal with hurt that is a hurt that cuts into your psyche. And so, you go to a psychiatrist, you get perhaps some help. You become part of the orthodox machine, and there's very little. Now I actually am excited to see where teacher plans are utilized in the setting of opioid addiction to actually get to the deeper level of these types of pain in the setting of ketamine, doing research with ecstasy in the setting of opioid addiction, using Tabernatha Iboga, another teacher plant, especially in the treatment context of heroin addiction. Not all of it legal, a lot of it done in countries, a lot of it done in a legal gray zone. But those are the level of depth that address pain at the level where it needs to be addressed, because everything else is just a coping mechanism to when you hit rock bottom and you're forced to deal with being with that original core trauma that needs healing.
Right.
And while heroin is a numbing medicine that gets you through the day, it doesn't ultimately provide you with the healing that's needed.
Right.
And so utilizing cannabis to create that state that allows you to approximate and explore those traumas, in your psyche, to create the space for it, is an exciting new way of dealing with it. And that's what I try to sort of look at from a harm reduction perspective, especially in that particular book. But now I'm getting excited about the research that's coming out of using psychotropics to get to the bottom of these deep hurts, for which people sadly use heroin to cope.
Agreed. Well, and we know the epidemic was, a an agenda almost. I mean, so that, once people became physically addicted, even if they didn't have a trauma, if they truly had a back injury or, whatever physical ailment that they used an opioid for, it quickly can become a physical addiction. And the one thing I just want to say about it, and thank you for that work that you've done, cannabis, I feel like sometimes can be kind of a warm hug while you're repairing those other things, as you spoke about, that deep psychological scar that might be present, with the help of other plant medicine modalities. But I just want to always remind people that if you are going to utilize cannabis to help you with getting off of opioids, that should always be done with a physician. And it can be, it can be dangerous for some people. So I just want to throw that caveat in, that it shouldn't be done by someone that's not really a licensed professional, maybe.
Absolutely. Especially, many times you see now people advertising their services as sitters, when I'm really concerned about their qualifications, about how are they going to handle when, an extreme crisis occurs, physiologically or mentally. How are they going to be prepared, and what is their qualifications for how to deal with that? And so in that context, it's always good to have a team of healers on your side. I mean, you're the captain in the driver's seat of that team, but to have a physician, to have a coach, to have a nurse, to have, a therapist, to have a good friend, a person who's been through a support group, the more help, the more people you have on your team, the more likely it's going to be that it's going to be effective for you.
Agreed. Lastly, and I will let you get on with your day, tell me about some of the other really exciting research that you are looking forward to seeing come forward and come through and see the results of.
Well, broadly speaking, there are two fields that I'm very much looking forward to learning more about or becoming more part of the consensus. And that is research related to the deep work that's done with teacher plants, with other psychotropics, and the overlap between what's been discovered there and the endocannabinoid system and endocannabinoid medicine. How we can best serve the clinicians that work in that context, and by extensions, the impact it has on the deepest possible healing that can be found in that type of setting, if you will. And the other thing has to do with the research that's done on the endocannabinoid dome, where we literally looking at simple things that anybody can do, either using a mind-body technique, using dietary consideration, utilizing nutraceuticals, utilizing herbs that are in alignment with your understanding, or with your clinicians, or with the scientific understanding of how it can be used to improve your endocannabinoid signaling, your endocannabinoid function, which is central to divorcing the idea or the notion of chronic from any other illness that's associated with that word. So if you have chronic this, chronic that, whatever it is, if you want to divorce that word from what you're dealing with and to reach for deep healing, there are two ways to deal with it. One is to utilize these things and activities that anybody has access to. You don't need to be a doctor.
Right.
It's easy to learn. It's easy to employ. That can make a significant difference in supporting this very system that's at the core of you being in a balanced state, in a resilient state. And then on the other hand is like the deep dive, that clearly deep focus on reaching the source of what's underpinning whatever it is that ails you at the deepest level. And so those two things, the research around that's emerging, and that's emerging now, I think it's going to be the future of medicine. And it's not going to be where a doctor tells you what to do, but where you are an equal partner, and if not more than an equal partner in that healing relationship. And I think that is another interesting shift in terms of the future of medicine.
The best thing to me about cannabis medicine and science, and I'll draw on something that Elizabeth Mack always says, is that we need to disrupt this paradigm of sick care, right? We are in a system where we're just throwing a pill and throwing another pill and throwing another pill, and now one pill's treating the side effect of the first pill that we gave. And so we need to disrupt this paradigm of this revolving sick care model and get back to one of wholeness and holistic approach and of homeostasis. This is how we do the real healing. And
Tell Elizabeth I said hi when you see her next time.
I will. She's a really great person. She's definitely a big role model for me. So yes. I lied. I want to ask you one more thing about how do we start initiating these conversations with providers, with patients? How do we get this talked about at the bedside and get it to the bedside, sir?
That is a good question. I think what we're doing here today is a really good step in that direction, because you never really know who is listening to this and what impact one word or one little story has on the belief of another person who's going to choose something different than what they chose before. And the ripples effects of that are very difficult to measure, impossible to measure, but still I have high hopes, and I do believe that the ripples will reach, and they keep on reaching in a way that's positive and beneficial to hopefully as many people as possible.
Yeah. My observation is we get it done with things like CannaKeys. Because it's a super easy and accessible way for someone that doesn't know a lot about cannabis to quickly become educated about it. And it's all evidence-based. So, to have that to draw on, this is a beautiful tool. And I just really want to thank you so much for the work that you've done on this. And it's incredible. We need more of it. So thank you for all that you've done in the field.
Thank you. It was nice to hear.
Yeah,
it was a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate your work. Do you have any final thoughts for my audience, or?
Yes, let's do it again. Spread the word.
Let's do it again. Yes. And then tell people where they can find you.
Go to CannaKeys.com, CannaKeys.com, and shoot us an email if you like. We usually answer them within a week or so, and we love to chat with like-minded spirits. We love to answer questions. Sometimes we even make them as part of our Q&A or FAQ section on the website. So we're always looking for a dialogue, and we're always looking for working together with people such as yourselves to continue this conversation, to embrace one heart at a time.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for supporting nurses the way you do too. I think you really get it. You get it that we're the medium between the physician and the patient, and we're the ones that help translate this information that's really complex and can be sometimes overwhelming in a setting where you're already maybe not feeling your best. So
you're the soul of healing in an otherwise cold tradition.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for saying that.
True.
That is it for Conversations with Kush tonight. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I can be found on YouTube and all audio platforms. Make sure to check out Dr. Blesching's work on CannaKeys. And I will also be linking the website and also the YouTube video. I thought the tutorial was very nice on YouTube, where it kind of walked you through. And so you can really get a great in-depth look at how the website can be useful to you and your practice, or just for you as a patient. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great night.